My name is Sienna Cole. I'm 29, and 6 hours before my mother slapped me in front of 240 guests, I'd signed a seven-figure ambassador contract with a bridal fashion house that had spent 3 years trying to get me to work with them. Nobody at my wedding knew that number. What they knew, what my mother apparently walked in already knowing, before she'd even found her seat, was that the dress I was wearing down the aisle wasn't the modest, lace-sleeved gown she'd picked out for me 8 months earlier at a boutique she'd chosen without asking. It was a fitted, open-back silk column dress the fashion house had built around me specifically, cut low enough across the shoulder blades that my mother would later describe it, loudly in front of my new in-laws, as something you'd wear to sell perfume, not to marry a man in a church. I want to be clear about something before I tell you what happened next. I am not, and have never been, ashamed of what I do for a living. I run a content company, 2.1 million followers across 3 platforms, a 6-person team that handles production and brand logistics, and a media kit that gets me priority meetings with people my mother has spent my entire career referring to as your little internet friends. I built that from nothing, starting in a college dorm room with a ring light I bought on clearance, and by the time I walked down that aisle, I was making more in a single sponsored campaign than my mother had made in 3 years as an elementary school administrator. To her, none of that had ever mattered. To her, influencer was a word she said the way other people say unemployed, a job that didn't fit inside the shape of anything she recognized as real. A doctor has a diploma on a wall. A teacher has a classroom. What did I have? A phone, a face, and, in her words, a job that could disappear the second people get bored of you. She wasn't entirely wrong about the volatility. She was entirely wrong about everything else. The wedding was at my in-laws' estate outside Charleston, string lights strung between 2 rows of live oaks, 240 chairs arranged in a wide horseshoe around an arch dripping in white orchids that the florist had flown in special. My husband, Marcus, stood at the end of the aisle in a navy suit, watching me with the specific, unguarded expression of a man who had never once, in 3 years of dating, asked me to be smaller than I actually was. I made it exactly 11 steps down the aisle. My mother rose from the second row, not the front row, because she'd insisted, weeks earlier, that she didn't need to be up front. This isn't about me. And crossed the grass in 4 fast, furious steps before anyone fully understood what was happening. The string quartet kept playing for 2 full measures after the slap landed, the musicians clearly not registering the sound over their own instruments, and I remember that detail more clearly than almost anything else from that day. The absurd, obscene mismatch of a Pachelbel cannon still swelling gently in the background, while my own mother's palm connected with the side of my face hard enough that my head actually turned with the impact. "No daughter of mine wears that," she said, loud enough that it carried past the front rows, past the aisle, out into the open lawn where 240 people had gone completely, utterly silent. You want to sell yourself to strangers on the internet? Fine. You do not do it at your own wedding, in front of God, wearing something a stranger built for you, instead of the dress your own mother picked out. My cheek was on fire. I could feel my own pulse in it, a hot, precise throb that seemed to be keeping time with my heartbeat. I didn't cry. I want you to understand that, because I think people expect the crying part, and it didn't come, not then. What came instead was a strange, floating stillness, the sensation of watching the entire scene from slightly outside my own body, cataloging details with a weirdly clinical precision, even as my face burned. My mother's chest rising and falling too fast, her hand still curled from the impact, Marcus already moving toward me before security even reacted. My father sitting frozen in his chair with an expression I'd never seen on him before, somewhere between horror and a resignation that suggested this wasn't entirely a surprise to him. 2 of the venue's security staff reached my mother within seconds, hands gentle but firm on her arms, guiding her back and away from the aisle while she kept talking, kept escalating, her voice cracking now into something closer to a scream. You think that dress is who you are? You think 2 million strangers watching you means anything? Ray would be ashamed of what you've turned into, Sienna. He would be ashamed. That name landed in my chest like a second slap, worse than the first. My Uncle Ray had been dead for 6 years. If you've ever had someone you love turn the happiest day of your life into a public referendum on who they think you failed to become, you already know there's no recovering the moment once it's happened. You can only decide what you do with everything that comes after. Drop a comment if you've ever had a celebration hijacked like that. I promise you, this story gets a lot bigger than one slap. Security walked my mother off the property entirely, at my father's quiet, defeated nod, and the wedding, somehow, impossibly, continued. Marcus held my hand through the rest of the ceremony so tightly I could feel his pulse against mine. And somewhere around the vows, I stopped shaking enough to actually say them, my voice steadier than I had any right to expect it to be. But underneath the ceremony, underneath the toasts and the first dance, and the specific, surreal effort of smiling for 240 guests who had all just watched my own mother hit me in front of God and an open bar, one question had already lodged itself somewhere behind my sternum and refused to leave. How had my mother gotten onto the property at all? The estate had a gated entrance with a guest list checked against ID at the door. Marcus's parents were particular people, the kind who hired private security for events like this, specifically to avoid exactly the sort of scene that had just happened. My mother wasn't on that list. I knew that for a fact, because I'd built the list myself, 3 weeks earlier, sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop open, deliberately, carefully leaving her name off it after the last conversation we'd had. A conversation that had ended with her telling me, flatly, that she wouldn't be attending a wedding built around your internet persona instead of an actual marriage. I hadn't invited her. And yet, she'd walked straight through a gated checkpoint, past private security, into a horseshoe of 240 chairs, and found a seat in the second row, like she belonged there. Someone had gotten her in. I didn't think about it seriously until 2 days later, once the adrenaline had drained out of my body and left something colder and more analytical in its place. The same clear-headed, methodical part of my brain I use every single day at work, the part that reads engagement analytics and spots the exact moment a campaign underperforms before anyone else on my team notices. I opened my laptop at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd built that guest list 3 weeks earlier, and pulled up the event coordinator's final RSVP export, a clean spreadsheet, alphabetized, every confirmed name cross-referenced against a check-in code assigned at the gate. My mother's name wasn't on the original list. That much I already knew, but when I scrolled down to the addendum tab, a short list of last-minute additions, 7 names in total, added in the final week before the wedding, there it was, Carol Cole, plus 1 guest pass added by L. Cole. My stomach dropped somewhere below the kitchen floor. L. Cole, my sister Lindsay. The same sister who'd spent the last 4 months telling me, in increasingly clipped phone calls, that she was handling Mom, so I wouldn't have to deal with the tension myself. The same sister who'd offered, back in March, to help manage some of Mom's finances after Dad's hours got cut at the plant, because Lindsay worked in real estate and understood paperwork better than any of us. The same sister who had, as far as I'd known until 9 seconds ago, spent the last several years quietly holding our fractured family together while I built a company on a phone screen 3 states away. I sat very still at that kitchen table, the cursor blinking on my sister's initials, and felt the first real crack open in a version of my family I'd been carrying around, unquestioned, for years. I didn't know yet what that crack was going to reveal. I only knew, staring at that spreadsheet at 11 at night with my cheek still faintly tender to the touch, that the story I'd been told about my own family, the story where my mother simply hated what I'd become, and Lindsay was the steady one holding everyone together, was not, I was beginning to suspect, the whole story at all. I opened a new folder on my desktop. I named it plainly, without ceremony, Wedding. It would not stay that small for long. I didn't confront Lindsay right away. That surprised even me, in the moment. Every instinct in my body wanted to call her the second I saw her initials on that spreadsheet, wanted to demand an explanation before the anger cooled into something more useful. I didn't, because 6 years of building a career out of reading data before reacting to it had taught me one hard rule. You don't go public and you don't go loud until you actually understand what you're looking at. So I did what I do for a living. I pulled the receipts. The first thing I checked was the money. For 4 years, ever since my father's hours got cut at the plant and my mother's pension turned out to be smaller than anyone had planned for, I'd been sending $800 a month to a joint account Lindsay had set up for Mom's expenses, groceries, her blood pressure medication, the property taxes on the house I'd grown up in. I'd set it up as an automatic transfer from my business account, the same account that handled sponsorship payouts and production invoices, tucked in among line items for lighting rentals and editing software subscriptions, easy to overlook precisely because it wasn't dramatic. $800 first of every month for 48 months. $38,400, not counting the extra we'd wired the Christmas her water heater died, or the $2,000 I'd sent in March when Lindsay texted that Mom needed new tires before winter. I sat at my kitchen table at midnight, 2 days after the wedding, with my accounting software open in one tab and my bank statements in another, running the actual total with the same cold, careful precision I use auditing a brand campaign's ROI. The number that came back made my hands go still against the keyboard. $41,200 over 4 years, sent specifically to support my mother. My mother, who had stood up in front of 240 wedding guests and told me, in front of God and an open bar, that I'd turned into someone who sold herself to strangers for money. My mother, who, as far as I could tell from 4 years of clipped, guarded phone calls, had no idea that number existed at all. I opened my messages with Lindsay next, scrolling back through 18 months of texts, looking for any reference to the transfers, any acknowledgement that Mom knew where the money was actually coming from. I found exactly none. What I found instead was a pattern I hadn't let myself see clearly until I was looking for it on purpose. Every single time, I'd asked casually whether Mom had gotten my last message, or whether she'd mentioned the birthday card I'd mailed, or whether she'd want to do a call for Mother's Day. Lindsay's answer had the same shape, almost word for word, every time. She's not really in a place to talk right now. I told her you said hi. She just doesn't want to make it a whole thing. Honestly, Sienna, I think it's easier if I just handle communication with her for now. She gets worked up. I'd believed every version of that sentence for 4 years. I'd built an entire understanding of my own mother around the idea that she'd simply decided, somewhere in my mid-20s, that I wasn't worth the emotional labor of staying close to. And Lindsay, steady, reasonable Lindsay, had simply been the messenger delivering that verdict, gently, so I wouldn't have to hear it directly from Mom's own mouth. If you've ever discovered that the person you trusted to relay a hard truth may have actually been the one writing it, you know exactly the specific, sick drop in your stomach that comes with realizing you might have been grieving a rejection that was never real. Drop a comment if you've ever had someone control the story between you and someone you loved. I promise the numbers get bigger from here. The next 3 weeks moved on 2 separate tracks, and I got disturbingly good, disturbingly fast, at keeping them from touching each other in front of anyone who might ask questions. Track 1 was work, and work did not slow down just because my family had detonated in front of 240 wedding guests. I had a bridal fashion campaign to shoot. The same seven-figure deal I'd signed 6 hours before the slap. A deal now uncomfortably tangled up in the exact controversy that had made headlines in 3 entertainment blogs within 48 hours of my wedding. My publicist wanted a statement. My brand partners wanted reassurance the story wouldn't tank engagement. I spent long nights at my kitchen table reviewing analytics dashboards, watching the wedding video clips someone had leaked spike to 11 million views across platforms, watching my own face get slapped in slow motion in 1,000 different reaction videos, comment sections split evenly between people defending me and people insisting I'd humiliated my own mother by flaunting a dress on the internet instead of just getting married like a normal person. I answered none of it publicly. I just kept working, because work, it turned out, was the one part of my life that hadn't shifted its shape overnight. Track 2 was quieter, and I told almost no one about it. Not my publicist, not my team, only Marcus, who sat beside me most nights while I built it, saying almost nothing, just staying present the way he'd stayed present at the altar. I was building a file. I pulled 4 years of bank statements and organized them by month, cross-referenced against every text where Lindsay had mentioned Mom needing something specific: tires, medication, a plumber. I found, methodically, that in at least 6 instances, the amount I'd sent didn't match the amount Lindsay had described needing, off by anywhere from $200 to $1,100, small enough each time to explain away as a miscommunication, large enough, added up across 4 years, to raise a very different kind of question. I found the county property records next, a habit I'd picked up from a real estate contract, dispute my legal team had walked me through 2 years earlier for a campaign gone wrong. I knew, now, how to actually read a deed. My mother's house, the one I'd grown up in, the one I'd been sending money to help maintain for 4 years, had a lien on it I didn't recognize. A home equity loan, $60,000, taken out 14 months earlier, co-signed with a power of attorney document listing Lindsay Cole as the authorized signer on my mother's behalf. I sat with that document open on my laptop for a long time, the cursor blinking over Lindsay's signature, and felt something in my chest go very cold and very still. Not rage yet, not quite. Something closer to the specific, clinical stillness I feel right before I present a client with numbers I already know they're not going to like. I found the letters last, and they were the ones that actually broke something open in me. I'd written to my mother 4 times over those same 4 years. Actual paper letters, not texts, because Lindsay had told me once, years earlier, that Mom didn't really do phones anymore for anything real, and preferred handwritten mail, something I'd taken at face value, because it sounded, at the time, like something my mother would actually say. I'd written about the company growing. I'd written about meeting Marcus. I'd written, in the 3rd letter, an actual apology for whatever distance had grown between us, offering to fly home for a weekend. No agenda, just to sit in her kitchen and talk. I found copies of none of those letters ever reaching her because I found, instead, in a box Lindsay had once asked me to store for her just until I get my own place sorted, 3 of my 4 original envelopes, unopened, my own handwriting on the front, my mother's address never crossed out or forwarded, simply never delivered at all. My hands were shaking by the time I set the 3rd envelope down on my kitchen table, not from fear, from something that felt, in that specific moment, dangerously close to grief, the recognition that I had spent years quietly mourning a mother who had rejected me, when what had actually happened was closer to something being stolen from both of us, one intercepted envelope at a time. Every family has a version of the story it tells itself about who left first and why. Sometimes that story only survives because one person controlled exactly how much of the truth ever reached the people who needed it. If you've ever found proof that changed the whole shape of a story you thought you already understood, keep watching. This one gets a lot bigger before it gets better. Marcus found me at the kitchen table close to 2 in the morning, 3 weeks after the wedding, surrounded by printed bank statements, a property deed, and 3 unopened envelopes addressed in my own handwriting. "You need to sleep," he said gently, sitting down across from me, and then, seeing my face, didn't push it further. He just picked up the property deed instead, read it slowly, and I watched something harden in his jaw as he got to the line listing Lindsay as power of attorney. "Does your mom know about any of this?" he asked. "I don't think she knows about any of it," I said. "I think she spent 4 years believing I stopped caring. I think Lindsay spent 4 years making sure she kept believing that." Marcus set the deed down carefully, squared its edges against the table. The way you handle something you understand is evidence now, not just paperwork. "What are you going to do?" I looked at the folder, no longer small, no longer named simply wedding, now organized into subfolders labeled financial, property, correspondence, growing heavier every night I added to it, the same careful, methodical documentation I'd use building a case for a brand dispute, except this time the stakes weren't a campaign contract. They were the actual shape of my family, and whether the story I'd been told about it had ever been true at all. "I'm going to find out exactly how deep this goes," I said, "and then I'm going to make sure my mother finally sees it too, not because Lindsay decides to tell her, because I show her myself, with proof she can't argue with." Marcus reached across the table and took my hand, the same steady grip he'd held through the entire ceremony while my cheek was still burning. "Then, let's find out," he said. I opened my laptop, pulled up the county records portal one more time, and started tracing the loan, where the $60,000 had actually gone because a home equity loan taken out under a power of attorney on a house I'd been quietly helping support for 4 years was not, I understood with total clarity by 3 in the morning, the last discovery this particular arithmetic was going to hand me. The loan trail led somewhere I hadn't expected. I'd assumed sitting at my kitchen table at 3 in the morning, 3 weeks after the wedding, that $60,000 pulled against my mother's house under a power of attorney would lead to something simple and ugly. A bad investment, a gambling debt, a boyfriend Lindsay had never mentioned. What I found instead, tracing wire transfers through 2 weeks of increasingly specific document requests to the title company and the county recorder's office, was stranger and colder than any of that. The money hadn't disappeared into anything reckless. It had gone, almost entirely, into a down payment on a 4-unit rental property 40 minutes outside the city, closed 11 months earlier, listed under an LLC with Lindsay as the sole managing member. I found the LLC's registration in about 6 minutes once I knew what I was looking for. I found the rental listings shortly after that, 4 units, all occupied, generating, based on the listed rates and a little arithmetic I did twice to make sure I hadn't made an error, just over $5,000 a month in gross rental income. My sister hadn't stolen $60,000 to survive an emergency. She'd built a business on top of it, quietly, patiently, over the better part of a year, using our mother's house as collateral for a loan our mother had never been told existed, using a power of attorney. Our mother may not have fully understood the scope of when she signed it. I pulled up the property records for all 4 units individually, cross-referencing purchase dates against the timeline of texts where Lindsay had described handling some paperwork for Mom that spring. Vague, unspecific, the exact kind of phrase you use when you're hoping nobody asks a follow-up question. I found photos of the property on a rental listing site, professionally staged, a small back patio with string lights strung between 2 posts, and something about that detail, the deliberate, careful staging of a property funded by a lie, made my stomach turn in a way the raw numbers alone hadn't managed to. I sat with that for a long time, the specific stillness that comes after outrage burns through its first, loudest phase and settles into something colder and more useful. I wasn't shaking anymore. My jaw had gone tight enough that I noticed it, a dull ache along the hinge, and I made myself unclench it, breathing slowly, the way I used to before a live segment when the numbers weren't landing the way I needed them to and panicking wouldn't fix anything. I called my mother that same week, the first time we'd spoken since the wedding. She answered on the fourth ring, her voice smaller than I remembered it, cautious in a way that surprised me, because caution had never been my mother's natural register. "Sienna," she said, and something in the way she said my name told me she'd been waiting for this call, dreading it and hoping for it in equal measure. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to actually answer it," I said, keeping my voice level. "Did you know I've been sending you money for the last 4 years? $800 a month through Lindsay's account." Silence on the line, long enough that I checked to see if the call had dropped. "What are you talking about?" she said finally. "Lindsay set up help for us after your father's hours got cut, from her real estate commissions. She said business had been good." I closed my eyes. There it was. Not a lie exactly. Not from my mother's side. A story Lindsay had constructed carefully enough that my mother had never once had a reason to question it. "Mom, it wasn't Lindsay's money," I said. "It was mine. $41,000 over 4 years, sent specifically to help you and Dad, and Lindsay never told you where it actually came from." The silence this time had a different texture to it. I could hear my mother's breathing change, quicker, unsteady. "That's not... Sienna, that doesn't make any sense. Why would she tell me it was her money?" "I don't know yet," I said, which was true, even though a cold, unwelcome theory had already started forming somewhere in the back of my mind. "But I also found out she took out a $60,000 loan against your house, Mom, under a power of attorney. Did you know about that?" The sound my mother made then wasn't a word. It was closer to something breaking, a small, sharp intake of breath that told me, more clearly than any answer could have, that she hadn't known any of it. Not the loan, not the LLC, not the 4 rental units generating $5,000 a month off collateral she'd apparently signed away without fully understanding what she was signing. "She brought papers over last spring," my mother said, her voice slow now, working backward through a memory she was clearly reconstructing in real time. "She said it was routine. Something about making sure I was protected if anything happened to your father or me, so she could handle things without a court getting involved." I didn't read it carefully, Sienna. I trust her. I've always trusted her. She's the one who's here. A pause, and I could hear something in her voice starting to crack apart at the edges. "Did I sign away my own house?" "Not exactly," I said, keeping my voice as steady and clinical as I could manage, the same tone I use walking a nervous brand partner through a numbers deck. "You signed a power of attorney, broad enough that she could take out a loan on your behalf without your direct signature on the loan itself. That's not the same as losing the house, but it's not nothing either, Mom. It means she had authority over your finances that you may not have fully understood you were giving her." I heard her set something down, a cup maybe, or the phone briefly against a counter, and when she came back, her voice had gone thin and unsteady in a way I genuinely never heard from her before, not once in 29 years. If you've ever had to be the one to tell someone you love that the story they'd trusted for years was never actually true, you know there's no gentle way to deliver that particular kind of proof. You just have to say it plainly and let them fall apart on their own terms. Drop a comment if you've ever had to be the one carrying news like that. It doesn't get easier, no matter how carefully you plan the conversation. "Why did you slap me?" I asked her, once the silence had stretched long enough that I understood she wasn't going to be the one to bring it up first. "At the wedding. Why did you say that about Ray?" My mother was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had gone thin and unsteady in a way I'd genuinely never heard from her before, not once in 29 years. "Lindsay called me that morning," she said. "She said you'd invited me, that there'd been some mix-up with the original invitations, and she was picking me up so I wouldn't miss it. On the drive over, she told me you'd built the whole wedding around one of your sponsorships, that the dress, the venue, all of it was just content for your feed. She said Ray would have hated seeing what you'd turned yourself into." A pause, ragged now. I believed her. I've always believed her, Sienna. She's the one who's been here. She's the one who checks on me every week, who handles the bills, who... I didn't have any reason not to believe her. I sat with that for a long moment, feeling something shift and settle inside my chest, cold and clear and finally, mercifully quiet. Not rage, something closer to the specific stillness of watching a spreadsheet resolve into a final number after you've spent an hour convinced the formula was broken. I understood, listening to my mother's voice crack apart on the other end of the line. Exactly what I had actually been to this family for the last 4 years. Underneath every version of the story, I'd been told about my own estrangement. I hadn't been a disappointment my mother quietly gave up on. I had been a resource, reliable, predictable, useful in the specific shape of $800 a month, arriving on schedule whether or not anyone above me in this arrangement ever had to say thank you, or explain where the money actually came from, or protect the one relationship that money was supposed to be sustaining. I had been infrastructure, something load-bearing and invisible, propping up a house I wasn't even allowed to know I was propping up, while someone else collected the credit, the trust, and, it turned out, a 4-unit rental portfolio on top of it. Infrastructure doesn't get invited to sit at the front of the wedding. Infrastructure gets slapped in front of 240 guests by a woman who was never given the chance to know the truth, and then goes home afterward to quietly keep paying the bills anyway, because that's simply what infrastructure does. I wasn't going to do that anymore. I stopped looking for my mother's understanding after that call, not because I'd stopped loving her, but because I finally understood that waiting for her to see me clearly had never actually been the point. She'd been lied to as thoroughly as I had. What I needed now wasn't her comfort, it was her testimony. "I'm going to need your help," I told her, my voice steady now, the shaking gone. "Not an apology. Not right now. I need you to tell an attorney exactly what you just told me, about the power of attorney, about what Lindsay told you the morning of the wedding, about what you did and didn't know about that loan." There was a long pause, and then, quieter than I'd ever heard my mother sound, she said, "Okay, whatever you need. I want to know the truth too, Sienna. I think I've wanted to know it for longer than I let myself admit. Sometimes the person who hurt you publicly turns out to be a second victim of the same lie that hurt you privately. That doesn't erase what happened. It just changes what justice is actually supposed to look like. Keep watching. The numbers are about to get a lot harder for one person in this story to explain away." I hired an attorney the following week, a sharp, methodical woman named Renata Okafor, who specialized in elder financial exploitation, recommended by a lawyer on my brand team who'd heard enough of the story secondhand to say flatly, "This isn't a family argument anymore, Sienna. This is fraud, and you need someone who does this specifically, not generally." Renata reviewed my folder in a single afternoon, the bank statements, the intercepted letters, the property deed, the LLC registration, the rental listings, and set it all down on her desk with the particular calm of someone who has seen this exact pattern before and knows precisely how it usually ends. "This is a strong case," she said. "Power of attorney abuse, undisclosed self-dealing, possible elder financial exploitation, depending on your mother's understanding of what she signed. If she's willing to testify to what she just told you on the phone, that she didn't know the loan existed, didn't know the money you sent was yours, didn't know your sister had a financial interest independent of caring for her, that's not just persuasive. That's often enough to end a case before it fully starts. What about the wedding? I asked. What she did there, is that even relevant? Renata considered that for a moment. It's relevant to motive, she said. Your sister needed your mother isolated from you specifically. A daughter sending $41,000 quietly over 4 years, without asking for credit or control. That's the kind of relationship that survives scrutiny. What doesn't survive scrutiny is a sister who's been diverting money and hiding alone. If your mother and you had ever compared notes honestly, this would have unraveled years ago. The wedding wasn't random cruelty, it was damage control. I sat with that in Renata's office for a long moment, feeling the last piece of the arithmetic settle into place. The slap hadn't been about a dress, or a career, or a dead uncle's memory. It had been the last, most desperate move available to someone who understood, on some level, that the truth was getting close enough to touch and needed one more wall, built between the two people who might finally compare their numbers and realize they didn't match. Let's file, I said. I want everything on the table. I want my mother in that courtroom hearing exactly what was taken from both of us at the same time, so neither one of us has to depend on someone else's version of the story ever again. Renata nodded, already reaching for a legal pad. Then, let's build it properly, she said. Every dollar, every document, every date. I left her office that afternoon and sat in my car in the parking lot for a long moment before starting the engine, feeling something I hadn't expected to feel yet, this early in the process. Not triumph, not even relief. Just a quiet, settled certainty, the specific calm of someone who has finally stopped waiting to be believed, and started instead on the much harder, much more useful work of making belief unnecessary. The truth, laid out properly, wouldn't need anyone's permission to be true. The hearing was set for a Thursday morning, 6 weeks after the wedding, in a civil courtroom with fluorescent lights that made everyone in the gallery look faintly gray. And I remember thinking, sitting there in a plain navy dress instead of anything my brand partners would have styled me in, how strange it was that a story that had started under string lights and orchids was ending under lighting this clinical and unglamorous. It felt right somehow. The truth didn't need staging. Lindsay arrived with her attorney 12 minutes late, wearing the same composed, capable expression she'd worn at every family dinner for the last decade, the expression of someone who had spent years being the one everyone trusted to handle things. She didn't look at me when she sat down. She looked at our mother instead, seated 2 rows back beside my father, and something flickered across her face that I couldn't fully read. Not quite fear yet. Not yet. Renata built the case exactly the way she'd promised she would. Methodically, without theatrics, letting the documents do the talking the way I'd learned over 6 years of building a business. That documents almost always do better than anger. She opened with the money. 48 consecutive transfers, $800 each, wired from my business account into the joint account Lindsay controlled, presented on a single, clean exhibit that made the number impossible to argue with. $41,200 sent specifically for my mother's care over 4 years. Ms. Rivers, Renata said, addressing my mother directly from the podium, using her formal, careful courtroom voice. Were you aware, at any point during those 4 years, that these funds originated from your daughter Sienna? My mother's voice, when she answered, was steadier than I'd heard it in 6 weeks. No, she said. I was told this money came from Lindsay's real estate commissions. I had no reason to believe otherwise. I watched Lindsay's jaw tighten at the defense table, a small, precise movement, the first genuine crack I'd seen in her composure since she'd walked in. If you've ever had to sit in a room and watch someone finally be asked, under oath, the exact question you'd spent years too afraid to ask them directly, you know There's a very specific kind of quiet that settles over you in that moment. Not triumph yet, just the recognition that the truth is finally being asked for instead of assumed. Drop a comment if you've ever waited that long for a question to finally get asked properly. Renata moved next to the property, the power of attorney document. Dated 14 months earlier, my mother's shaky, trusting signature at the bottom of a form she'd since admitted, under Renata's careful questioning, that she'd signed without reading in full, on Lindsay's assurance that it was just routine protection. Then came the loan. $60,000 drawn against my mother's house, the same house I'd grown up in, the same house I'd been quietly helping support for 4 years, without ever knowing a separate debt was accumulating against it in parallel. Renata walked the court through the LLC registration, the 4 rental units, the staged patio with string lights strung between 2 posts, the $5,000 a month in gross rental income flowing into an account with Lindsay's name on it and nobody else's. "Ms. Cole," Renata said, turning finally to Lindsay directly, "can you explain to the court why your mother's signature authorizing this loan does not appear anywhere in the closing documents, despite her name remaining on the property deed as sole owner?" Lindsay's attorney started to object, something about the framing of the question, but Lindsay spoke before he'd finished the sentence, her voice suddenly loud in the quiet courtroom, cracking in a way I'd genuinely never heard from my sister in 34 years of knowing her. "I was going to pay it back," she said. "I was going to refinance once the unit stabilized and pay off the loan before she ever needed to know it existed. I wasn't trying to hurt her. I was trying to build something so I'd finally have enough to actually help this family the way everyone always assumed Sienna already had, with her money and her followers and her—" She stopped herself, breathing hard, and in the sudden silence that followed, I watched her attorney's hand come up gently onto her arm. Too late, the sentence already out in the open where nobody could take it back. "You intercepted her letters," Renata said quietly. Not a question this time, just a statement laid down like the final piece of a structure that had been building for the better part of an hour. "You told your mother the wedding was staged for a sponsorship. You arranged her access to a wedding your sister had deliberately not invited her to, on the same day you needed a reason strong enough to keep them from ever comparing notes honestly again. Isn't that right, Ms. Cole?" Lindsay didn't answer for a long moment. When she finally did, her voice had gone very small. All the composure I'd known my whole life. Finally, completely gone. "I needed her to hate me," she said, quiet, and at first I thought she'd misspoken. Used the wrong pronoun, meant Sienna instead of the mother sitting 2 rows behind me. Then I understood. Not Mom, Sienna. I needed Sienna to think Mom had given up on her, so she'd stop trying so hard, so she wouldn't come home more, ask more questions, get closer to figuring out what I was doing with the account. It was easier if they both just believed the other one had stopped caring. It was easier than either of them finding out what I'd actually done. The courtroom was silent after that, in a way I don't think I'll ever forget. Not stunned exactly, more like the specific quiet of a room absorbing the full shape of something ugly finally being said plainly, out loud, by the one person who'd spent years making sure it never would be. I didn't look at Lindsay. I looked instead at my mother, 2 rows behind me, and found her already looking at me, her face doing something I hadn't seen it do in longer than I could remember. Not anger, not even grief exactly. Something closer to recognition. The specific, quiet understanding of a woman realizing, in real time, that the daughter she'd struck in front of 240 wedding guests had spent 4 years quietly keeping her afloat, had written her letters that never arrived, had never once stopped trying, even while believing, the entire time, that she'd been the one who'd given up first. Judge Alvarez, a measured woman who had listened through the entire hearing without much visible reaction, finally spoke. "Given the admissions on the record today, and the documentary evidence presented, The court finds sufficient grounds to proceed with removal of Ms. Lindsay Cole as power of attorney, effective immediately, along with a referral for further investigation into the property transaction described. Will reconvene in 30 days to address restitution. It wasn't a dramatic gavel-bang ending. It was quieter than that, more procedural, more real, which, I think, made it land harder than any scripted courtroom moment could have. The truth hadn't needed theatrics. It had just needed a room where someone was finally required to answer honestly. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive as a single explosive confrontation. It arrives as someone finally being asked the right question, in the right room, with no more room left to redirect it somewhere else. If this story's courtroom moment landed the way I hoped it would, drop a comment. I read every single one, and I promise this ending isn't quite finished yet. My mother found me in the hallway outside the courtroom afterward, and for a long moment, neither of us said anything at all. She looked smaller than I remembered her looking at the wedding. 6 weeks and an entire collapsed version of her family ago. "I hit you," she said finally, her voice raw, in front of everyone, over a dress, over a lie I believed, because it was easier than admitting I didn't actually know my own daughter anymore. I don't know how you forgive something like that. I don't know that I have yet, I said honestly, because I'd promised myself, sitting in that gallery an hour earlier, that I wasn't going to perform an easy reconciliation just because the truth had finally come out. But I know now that you didn't hit me because you stopped loving me, Mom. You hit me because someone spent years making sure you never had the chance to actually know me at all. Those aren't the same thing, even if they left the same mark. My mother's eyes filled, and this time she didn't try to hide it, didn't try to compose herself the way she had at every family gathering I could remember. "I want to know you," she said. "The real version, not the one Lindsay described. I want to come to your studio, if you'll let me. I want to understand what you actually do, instead of deciding it doesn't count, because I don't understand it yet." "Okay," I said, and meant it, even though I understood. Standing in that fluorescent hallway, that 6 weeks of proof didn't erase 29 years of a story I'd been told about my own worth. It just gave us both, finally, an accurate starting point to rebuild from. I didn't reconcile with Lindsay. I want to be honest about that, because I think stories like this one too often rush toward a tidy ending where everyone forgives everyone, and that's not what happened here. And I don't think it needed to. The court ordered restitution over the following months. The rental property sold, the proceeds redirected toward repaying the loan against my mother's house, a formal accounting of every dollar Lindsay had diverted. My sister and I have not spoken since the hearing. I don't know if we ever will. Some betrayals cost you the relationship permanently, and I've made my peace with that being the honest outcome instead of a manufactured one. My mother came to my studio 8 weeks later on a quiet Tuesday and sat in the corner of my set while my team filmed a segment for a campaign, watching, genuinely curious for what I think was the first time in my adult life, as I walked a crew of 6 through lighting adjustments and script revisions with the same precision she'd once assumed I couldn't possibly possess. "This is real work," she said afterward, quietly, like the sentence cost her something to say out loud. "I didn't understand that before. I'm sorry it took all of this for me to actually look." "You're looking now," I said. "That's what matters." I still have the folder. Wedding, then financial, property, correspondence, the whole architecture of proof I built over 6 sleepless weeks. I keep it now, not because I need it anymore, but because I think everyone should hold on to at least one piece of evidence, somewhere solid, from the exact moment they stopped waiting for someone else to hand them the truth and went and found it themselves. The dress that started it all hangs in my closet now, cleaned and pressed, the same fitted silk column my mother once told 240 guests I should be ashamed to wear. I look at it sometimes and think about how much of that day I misunderstood in real time. The slap, the scream, the name of a dead uncle used like a weapon. All of it aimed, in the end, not at who I actually was, but at a story someone else needed my mother to believe, badly enough to walk her, unknowing, straight into the worst moment of both our lives. I wasn't ashamed of that dress then, and I'm not ashamed of it now. I kept it, in the end, for the same reason I kept the folder. Some proof is worth holding on to, long after the people who doubted you have finally run out of reasons to. End.